Alright, so today I'll be presenting on the RAF hunger strike, specifically on the legacy it had for the 70s decade and terrorism in general in Europe. So, as you guys read in Judd, there was kind of an emergence of domestic terrorism in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, beginning in the late 60s and going on into the 70s. And what most scholars argue is that it's a product of the baby boomer generation and then kind of a revolt of the traditional principles that were in place with their parents that were children of World War II. So there was kind of this theme of a formation of left-wing guerrilla groups that were like committed to an armed struggle that's kind of revolting against the established social order. And some of these groups, examples of, as we read, the revolutionary cells, who were similar to the Red Army faction, anti-imperialistic cells, Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine, which was kind of a little bit different because they were dealing more with Israel, but they were also had a global view of like socialism. And specifically for today, we're focusing on the Red Army faction. So many of these, but in particular the RAF, carried out bombings, assassinations, bank robberies, protests, and strikes, as we see with the hunger strike. Bank robberies were pretty imperative because they gave them the finances to fund their efforts. So they often killed people within their bank robberies as like kind of a collateral damage, as they would say. So just a little background on the RAF. So it's kind of like a combination of Marxism and Maoism with a commitment to violence in order to get a communist world. So they were hugely anti-imperialist, and they viewed imperialism as any sort of forced ideology of the Western world that the Western world was having on the rest of the world. So they did not like that one bit. And they claimed that West Germany and the rest of the West were fascists, particularly that West Germany was kind of still part of this Nazi regime. That was their big claim. But our purposes today, we're going to talk about the hunger strike and the legacy that it left. So throughout the 1970s, the members of the RAF were imprisoned for their very egregious crimes. So like violence, murder, bank robbery, like I said earlier. So the most notable of this was Ulrike Meinhof, and she was kind of the de facto leader, and she continued to be the leader through prison. But she was one of the members that underwent the hunger strike and kind of organized it and popularized it and kind of created an ideology out of it. And what was imperative for her goal was that she created like an intricate network of communication channels. This was mainly done through her lawyers and smuggling information in and out. And through prison, she was kind of able to run the group and edit newspapers and get the message out there while still being in prison and still striking for hunger for better conditions and to promote her own cause. So the network was kind of known as they described it like there was an info and an outfo. The info were the RAF prisoners and the network they established within the prison. And they would, collect information, pictures, descriptions of their conditions. And then the outfo were, and that would be given to the lawyers who would be then part of the outfo, who would be just like a network of publications that would be able to kind of blast this into West Germany, the West German public, and it would eventually lead to the commercial media coverage, which would gain a lot of exposure for the RAF's message. So just see this picture kind of gives a good example. So the info and outfo network really worked and kind of gained support for their cause. As you can see, there's a massive group of mostly young people. As you can see, you kind of have communist symbols. You have the star, you have Castro. I'm sure there's plenty of other things that I can't read because it's in German and very small. But it had a pretty big effect because on the outside people. So the network worked and it went to the commercial channels and was able to kind of spread their message. But this gave a lot of support among the youth. The youth kind of like college students, people that are like our age, really supported their cause as kind of establishing a new order. Got a lot of people mad. So I just a quote from one of the articles that we had that kind of really hones in this point is the support of doctors was also integral to legitimizing the RAF's medicalized politics. Physicians campaigned against the treatment of prisoners by publishing declarations in open letters and by supporting events. So this is really important because part of their the information they were getting out was based off their harsh imprisonment and the effect it has on the physical human body as well as the mental the mental brain and everything. So they were able to get support from West German physicians and doctors that were condemning the conditions that they were in and kind of basically just taking the RAF side, which was pretty instrumental in getting legitimizing their support. And one of the big things that they were able to kind of accomplish through the media was that they created a comparison between them and their treatment and the Nazi treatment of their prisoners, particularly the Holocaust. You could have some pretty striking imagery between the people who were on the hunger strike, the not eating for months, and the Holocaust survivors. So there was actually direct campaigns to compare those two and say that they were similar, and this was kind of a continuation of this quote fascist Nazi regime. So yeah, like I said, just another quote that kind of comes in this point. The group conceived themselves to some extent as a belated resistance movement, and self-starvation was a key element in their conception of the prisoner as a Nazi victim. So that kind of made them seem as if their cause was noble because they're fighting against an oppressive fascist regime. So this was kind of a turning point for the RAF. Holger Mines was a prominent RAF member, and he died while on hunger strike. I think it was like 72 days he was going without eating after like refusing to force feed and everything. So Mines' death in 1974 during the third hunger strike allowed the fantasies of the RAF victims to intrude starkly into the public realm. So this really seemed to, at this point, the author argues and I argue that by the death of one of the members in prison, it kind of solidified their message that they're being mistreated, and also somewhat of made them seem as if their cause was somewhat noble. So basically the big point here that I want to convey is that the RAF was able to go from terrorists to victims of brutality and oppression. And just another quote, the RAF overcame the isolation of the penal system via a sophisticated network based on the privileged relationship between the prisoners and the lawyers. So they had this intricate network that was able to get this cause out. And I say here that through their sophisticated communication network, the RAF was able to gain exposure as a victim of fascist oppression, and through their dedication and determination, they were able to promote their cause to the general public. So they were able to kind of transcend this view of terrorists and be more in victim and get support for a revolt against the established government. So the hunger strikes allowed the RAF prisoners to inscribe in their bodies their conception of a belated Nazi resistance. So this made their cause noble in their eyes. They were part of the group that's taking down this neo-Nazi regime, which gained some support within the public, and they kind of viewed it as well. So the big question for this presentation and the argument is the legacy, and I argue that the legacy of the RAF is regardless of their cause, they were able to promote innovative tactics that allowed them to transcend from terrorists and move into victims. So this created a trend in the 1970s and the 80s, like we viewed, of domestic terrorism in Europe, and oftentimes these groups would get so much support, or they would get so much media attention that people would forget about the crimes that they're creating to get this attention and think about more of their cause. Like as we saw with the Palestine issue, people really noticed it and didn't see them as terrorists, but rather noble in their fight. So yeah, like I said, throughout the 70s and 80s, the methods like it were popularized and became a defining aspect of those decades. That's it.